Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Order of Australia Eastern Suburbs Regional Group. We've been very pleased at the response to our webinar series, and this is the second one this year. And it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Hazel Edwards. Let me just highlight a few things as we welcome Hazel. I noted that the first young adults novel came out in 1972. Which means you've been writing for a long time, Hazel. Congratulations. And that in that time you've had over 200 books published. And if you add to that the number of translations and adaptations, it must be a much more significant number. Hazel has a very wide range of interests and has written about many more things than I even knew about when I first contacted her to arrange this. I'd been familiar, as had our family, for a long time with her book about the hippopotamus, a well-thumbed copy, Hazel. But I hadn't realised that she had such a wide range of writing topics, including writing about writing, and tonight speaking about writing. And part of that has been a keen interest, I know, in helping others who are writing, and particularly writing about their families. I'm sure it's been an interesting life as you manage, Hazel, the balance between writing and having a family, and that's your topic tonight. And so I welcome you, and I'll hand over to you, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I find it fascinating to discover we live within streets of each other geographically and didn't even know. That's wonderful. I called tonight, I think it's this afternoon's talk, not just a piece of cake, being an author, because that was the title I finished up with for what's closest to being an autobiography for me. I have read some excruciating misery memoirs, and I was determined not to contribute to them. And one of the things that I had come across was people who do the listing, the begets, who was born, who died, and who married in the middle, and so on. I didn't want to do that. So I thought, why don't I write about something that I do actually know, and that is how to juggle family and being an author, and being able to do some adventurous things like being an Antarctic expeditioner. Although I must say, at the time I started writing, I had absolutely no idea that I would be stuck in a polar ship with 34 blokes and 4 other women for 3 weeks, and a chopper would crash on top of us. I didn't plan that in my writing career, but things happen. So that's really the reason for the rather odd title of tonight's talk, to tie in with that book, because frankly, naming books is as hard as naming children. The only difference is the books can't complain. The children always complain. Whatever name you've given them, there's always something wrong. And I must say, our family's had a range of interesting names for which I'm partly responsible. My son is called Trevelyan Quest Edwards, and I think Quest is a fantastic name for anyone who does adventurous things or writes, and he's written a couple of books too. My grandson's called Arafura, and when you travel around Darwin, every council sign has his name on it. It's very good for his reading ability. So I think an unusual name has a few points in its favour. But I wanted to talk about the real life of being an author. I was driving home yesterday, and I listened to the ABC, and they were talking about glossy careers. In other words, occupations that sound absolutely fascinating to anyone who doesn't do them. They sound very glamorous. And children's author is one of those. A lot of people think it's a very easy life, but let me tell you, it can be a little challenging at times. I find that people make the mistake of assuming that the writer's IQ is commensurate with the age of the reader. And I don't think that's fair. It is much, much harder to write for a young reader because they'll tell you exactly what they think of your writing, and they'll turn it face down and give it the yawn test. I write for adults as well, mainly adult mysteries, partly to improve my plotting. I don't know how many people have said to me, are you going to write a real book when you grow up? And I say, children's books are real books. They are the most challenging to write of all of them, and they're around for so much longer. I smiled when Geoffrey held up his Hippo on the Roof Eating Cake book. I must say, it's a mixed blessing to be called the hippopotamus lady, because I'm quite tall and I used to be quite wide, but I'm a bit thinner these days. And this is a very well used hippo, the book, which is actually in Braille. And I am thrilled when I see a book that's been well thumbed and well used, because it means it's been put to an appropriate use. So I still live in the same house that had the leak in the roof. And let's face it, the best stories come from things going wrong, right? And we had a defective roof in a new house. And my then 4-year-old son, as the rain poured down all over everything, and the workman came to fix the roof, said, that's the hippo up there that eats cake. And we said, oh, yes. And so for a little while, we had to set a place at the table for the hippo, who's, I don't know about his use of cutlery, but in recent years, he's learned to write answers to fan mail. So he was obviously multi-talented. The hippo, people say to me, how come that story became so popular? I think it's because many children want the reassurance of a large friend who's got the answers. Let's face it, adults would like that too. But I think that is actually the appeal and the look of Deborah Nyland's illustrations. So even now, I get an occasional knock at the front door, not during COVID, I have to say, not during lockdown, and go out and there's a child there. And the child says, is this the hippo? Is this the house where the hippo lives? And I have to say, have a look. Because if I say yes, or if I say no, I am not maintaining the fantasy, the logic of the fantasy of a book. And that's really, really important. And when the production of the hippo that Gary Ginnivan did on stage, the actor, Andrew, who played the hippo, was very careful not to be seen in and out of his costume. They preserve the fantasy. I had a 6-year-old grandson with me at that stage, and I thought, do I take him backstage and destroy some of the fantasy, or don't I? But we managed with that one. All right, so the fan mail can be really, really poignant. And I don't mean just for the hippo, it can be for other stories too. And that's one of the joys of being an author. In terms of risks, you certainly take risks in terms of the subject matter that you might deal with, but a children's author, most people don't know you, they know the book. And the book stands on its own and has a life of its own. I stood in a queue in the local library one day, and somebody ahead of me, a young girl, had taken out one of my books. It wasn't a hippo book, and she was standing there reading it. And I thought, I'm not going to say anything. I'll just watch and see what she does. And then I thought, oh my goodness, there's a photo on the back of the book. I wonder if she matches the photo to the stranger in the queue. Well, she didn't actually, but I do try and keep my photos within at least 5 years of my face, because otherwise people never recognise you. Most authors have got a flash photo, which is probably the one I gave you to go on your program. In real life, we look a little bit different. So that's the gap between the idea and the reality. Now, in terms of the significance of writing and fan mail, I always answer fan mail. I don't know, you'd always call it fan mail. I get mail from adult readers too, but they usually tell you what you've done wrong, or that you should have checked something or other. Or these days they might tweet you or troll you. But when you get a genuine compliment from a reader, that is fantastic. I'd like to read, I had a lot of trouble writing this anecdote. An anecdote's a mini story, and that's how this book was written. I decided I'd take the most common questions people ask me, and I'd write around the poignant things that had happened. I wouldn't necessarily do it in chronological order. So I'd just like to read you this one, because I would say of all of the responses, this is the one that touched me the most. It made me think, yes, it's worthwhile. Some of you would know about the cake angels. These are the people who make cakes for children in the hospitals and so on. And this child was 13. B was a much loved, incapacitated 13-year-old for whom Hippo was her favourite read, multiple times every day. Now, I didn't know of B until after her funeral, at which the book was read. Told of this at a literary festival some months later by an illustrator colleague who was her family friend. I found a gift copy in my briefcase of, guess what? There's a hippopotamus on the hospital roof eating cake, which is one of the sequels. And but I didn't know what to write in it. Generally, authors have a standard signature, which is different from the one you use on your bank account. Very important that it's not the same signature. But I didn't know what to write as the dedication. But after some thought, I autographed it to the family of B. And then sometime later, a private Facebook message just arrived. Dear Hazel, you don't know me, but recently you gave a copy of one of your books to my daughter via F, who told you about B and her recent passing. Bev, B loved your books, all of them, but the hospital one was particularly her favourite, maybe because she knew the journey in the ambulance so well herself. She shredded many copies and got at least one new hippopotamus book every year. I went so far as to record them with her, with me telling the stories, so she could read them off my iPhone when we were out and she was bored. She was and is our angel. Blessings to you from B and her family. Now, when I went back to check her family's permission for me to use that anecdote, because I wouldn't have used it without their permission, her mother said, yes, what a wonderful gift. Today would have been B's birthday. Now, I'm not superstitious, but I just realised that my writer friends, Suzanne Gervais, who is in here, it was actually at the hotel, the boutique literary hotel she owned a few years ago, that occurred. I just suddenly realised I'm beginning to put all these things together tonight. It seems very interesting. Okay, so in terms of the fan mail that comes, and I always answer. In the past, it used to come in the letterbox, and it'd be snail mail. Now I have snails in my letterbox, and they were eating the mail, and that ended up as a story called Snail Mail too. But these days, it usually comes via email, or often if writers do visits to schools and so on, you'll get a lot of mail. People say to me, do you prefer a print book, an e-book, or an audio? I don't mind. I think the important thing is the story. And if it's going to be an audio, should you read it yourself? Well, I've read a couple, but I'm not really an actor, and I prefer mine to be read by someone else. But why is it risky for being an author? Well, I think I'm not really adventurous, but I've done a few things that other people consider adventurous because I want to know why the other people do it, and so I can write about them effectively. So I heard of the opportunity to go to Antarctica on an expedition with the Australian Antarctic Division. Now, I was known in my family for getting lost when we went orienteering. I was the lowest listing in the women's under 40 B for orienteering because I got lost so much and took me so long to get in. My family said to me, how would you cope with Antarctica? You don't even like the cold. And I said, well, that is true. But I had heard of another writer who'd gone down there, and I was seduced by the artwork of the icebergs that she had done. And later I realized the icebergs are a bit like writing. There's 9/10 underneath the surface, and there's only 1/10 that shows above. And her icebergs were what seduced me. So I thought, I haven't got any hobbies to put on the back of my books. Maybe I could read about Antarctica for a year and then apply to go. So I started reading, and I found they didn't have many women going to Antarctica or who'd written about it. I put in, I walked up and down, and I got myself fit, and I went off to do the Antarctic medical, which is a bit like they do for pilots. My doctor's son-in-law said, Hazel, you won't be too disappointed when you fail, will you? I mean, you can do other things. And I said, well, I'm going to give it my best shot. They sent me a form, and I knew I would never get there. They asked if I had a prostate. They'd sent me the male category instead of the female. So I pointed that out to them. I thought, I'm not giving up at this point. So off I went to do the medical and sweated and pounded my way through it, and I got through. I was terrified. I thought I could have failed with honour, but no, I was destined to go. You're allowed to choose where you go. The arrangement is that you go on the round trip, which is usually about 3-4 weeks, resupplying the various Antarctic bases. I did lots of reading about Antarctica. I looked at the map, and Casey Station was the closest, so that was the one I put down. And so I was destined to go. I asked my family, I said, how do you feel about it? And my husband said, well, go for it. My son said, Mum, it's usually me going to places like that, not you, but go for it. And my daughter gave me some thick socks and said, I'll keep in touch with you electronically. That was the most useful of the lot. But I did get listed for the polar bird, and I found myself on the Hobart Wharf thinking, what am I doing here? I'm going off with this bunch of men I've never seen in my life before. I'll probably get seasick. Why do I say I'll do something when I don't know whether I can or not? Because, of course, prior to that, you are outfitted by the Antarctic Division. You go to Hobart, you are kitted out with all of the long johns and all of the other gear that you need to wear. Well, luckily, I'm tall, so I got all the new stuff. There was one woman who was being sent down there, and she got all the woolen stuff that the young men who'd been sent down, who'd never washed their own clothes before, had shrunk all their clothes, and she got the lot. I got the new stuff. But it was a requirement that you could do, when the alarm went, you had to get dressed in all of this stuff and get to the lifeboat in under 4 minutes. Well, I came to an arrangement with the guy who was going to be in the cabin next to me that we'd strip and dress each other because there was no way I was going to make it in 4 minutes. And I wasn't too sure which way the lifeboat was facing, starboard. Which way do you go when depending on which. Anyway, I polished it up and I survived. But we did end up stuck in the ice. Very interesting experience. I don't think there's been anything out of any of the other ones that I've done that have been as fascinating. I wanted to know why people were going there. I wanted to know whether they were running away from home or they were running to adventure. Bit of both, bit of both. And some keep going back. I came away with the greatest respect for the problem-solving skills of all the expeditioners, even though it was very challenging. They allotted a, they say the goods are odd, but the odds are good for females in Antarctic, but I was happily married, but you had to have somebody that you were paired off with for reasons of safety. So I chose one with brain and one's with brawn. I thought that was the best way to go, that I'd managed to survive. And they were fantastic to me. I was very conscious of not being physically as able as everybody else in this group. Marathon runners, as a matter of course. I'd been an orienteer for 20 years, but I was hopeless. I was only doing it to keep the family happy. So it was quite challenging. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to keep my end up. I wouldn't be able to scramble in and out of the hags or the choppers or whatever it was, wouldn't be able to do the distance, and wouldn't be able to wee into this FUD they give you, female urinary device, gentlemen. You have a certain asset in the Antarctic that females unfortunately have to use this device. The female station leader showed us how to do it, and she said she'd had trouble too. So it's really, really challenging. I was terribly worried I wasn't going to keep up. But what happened was they respected the fact that I was a writer. A lot of them had children who'd read my books, but the expeditioners are big readers because they're there for so long and there's very long winters. And I didn't realise when I first went on board that under every seat is a whole lot of books that are going down on that expedition, and they never come back. They stay down there. So the books keep increasing. Their favourite writer was Jeffrey Archer, and at that stage he was incarcerated somewhere else. So it was an interesting experience, and I came away thinking, what fantastic problem solvers they were, and they've kept in touch with me. I've written a lot of Antarctic-based stuff. I came back with a lot more scientific knowledge than I went down with. So this is one of the advantages, I think, of both of the family influences, but also of the risk-taking. You've got to have a go. I trekked in Nepal with a group of spirited women. They were women of spirit who'd come out of my Witty Women lunches, where everyone brought along a quote by or about a witty woman. We had one on spirited women, and we ended up in Nepal, and it was very challenging. All of the other women were leaders in their field, and I thought, go on, I'm not going to get up that mountain, but I did in the end. And so you need to stretch yourself. You need to keep trying. And as a result of that, my family's had an enriched life. We've met some very interesting people. So the first part is the types of risk, but there's another type too, and that is that writers take emotional risks and they take social risks because they may write about subjects that others find controversial. The present question about cultural appropriation, whether indeed you can write about cultures from which you have not come. I have quite strong views on that because I believe that with proper research and respect, you can write about other cultures. If you don't, and you're a professional writer, you'll write one book because you can only write an autobiography. You can't write anything else. My children went to a Jewish school and we're not Jewish. And when my daughter was there, I wrote a book called Misfit about a girl who wasn't Jewish in a Jewish school. I had tremendous help in writing that book. I asked her before I wrote it, everyone's going to assume it's you, because we committed the faux pas of having her birthday on Yom Kippur and nobody came. So we had to move it, and everybody explained things to us, and we had a great deal of support. So my children were in the situation of the reverse of most cultures, where they were a minority, within a school, within a wider community. And I think that's kept them in good stead in Outlook. But it also, for a writer, they need to be able to be androgynous, that is, write from many possible genders, but only with respect. The issues come up recently about whether you can co-write. Co-writing is a way of enabling someone from a lesser known culture to perhaps get their world and stories told, but not all agree with that. Okay, I'd like to just move on to the quiet heroes. If you ask a lot of kids who's their hero, they'll say the local footy guy who's been misbehaving and is on the front page. That's not so at all. There are lots of quiet heroes in most people's families. And so I've been running the Writing Non-Boring Family History course for a while, and I am thrilled to hear the stories of quiet heroes from people's own lives. And the reason it came about was that I'm not a genealogist. I always say I'm not a genealogist. And when I started the non-boring family history, lots of families kept sending their older relatives who were recently retired to me to write a story that others would want to read. And I was in a country town, and a local journalist wrote me up as gynecologist Hazel Edwards. And I pointed out I wasn't that either. And she said, oh, well, it's one end of life or the other. And I thought that was quite an amusing way of looking at it. But the non-boring bit, the secret to being non-boring is you start with the most interesting thing, you finish with the second most interesting, and you bury the boring bits in the middle, all right? And it's not a chronological boredom. You want to use anecdotes and stories. History is high gossip. Now, you're going to get in trouble with families if you write it. Every family has secrets, and everybody's got a different view, but you do the best to research it accurately, and then you say to them, well, why don't you write your version if you're not happy with this version? And so that's why quite a number of people now call themselves hazelnuts. They're people who've been mentored through to finish their books, and they've enjoyed the process of doing so. An example would be George Kyriakos, who's of Greek Macedonian background, who worked in the shoe industry. He's got a fantastic title for his book, If the Shoe Fits. Now, that's a good title. I really appreciate that title. And he's written about his family, and in the process solved a mystery of what happened to his sister. Most families have secrets. They have secret members of their family, and it can occasionally with DNA be a little bit disconcerting for others, but you never know. I have a group of doctors who've been attached to me with migrant backgrounds who have been writing their stories, and all of them are involved with music as well. And so one of them started the Doctors Orchestra, and so he's written Music is Medicine, and that's a project underway at the moment. So there are many, many quiet heroes, and often the modest people are not written about. So think about who it is from your story. I had an Auntie Violet who was not a public figure, but she's my heroine. She quietly got on with her life, looked after her adopted retarded son, and did lots of things for other people, and she was fantastic. She's my heroine, and nobody had written about her before. So do that for the ones in not just the high adventure, the other things. Okay, I've got to get a move on, haven't I? Antarctica fits the participant observation experience. That's going and doing something so you can write about it afterwards. You can do that, or you can draw on knowledge that you've had. I have exploited my family in that if they've had interests, I've used the interest, but I don't commit what I call literary terrorism. And that is writing about people, giving your spin on their lives that they're not happy about, or embarrassing moments. You don't do that. Just literary terrorism you avoid. But certainly there would be knowledge within your family or things that you've done. Now, surprisingly, I've used belly dancing. I've been doing belly dancing 101 for 19 years now. And I took the first belly dancing class in Antarctica when we got stuck with the women who were on board, and that made history. But I ended up going to belly dancing because I was asked to come up with a script for Channel 7 prior to the Olympic Games. And I thought maybe for children, I thought maybe the bookworm character could belly dance. And then I discovered it couldn't. I went to a belly dancing class and found you needed arms to hold your veil up. So that was no good, but I stayed for the class regardless. So some experiences you don't plan, but just have to be willing to have a go. So I'm an adventurous fraud, but I use it for the writing. Boredom in Antarctica is the problem, not action. And so boredom, because there are long periods where you're isolated, it was a very interesting thing to find out, and that's why they're such keen readers. That's the interior world matters. They were all writing something or other. They got me to judge their poetry competition. I said I'd prefer not to have any crude examples, so they tidied them up a bit. And so we had the poetry competition, but everybody was writing something or other. And then when we got stuck in the ice and I wrote the Lockyberg, which was for a child I knew back here about an iceberg, they all pinched the story and put their kid's name on it. I said, look, there's a concept called copyright, but at this case, you feel free to use it. You've done plenty to help me. So that's where the Lockyberg story came from. Okay. Embarrassing moments, we've all had them, but writers exaggerate them and capture them in stories. A lot of people, particularly when they retire, do lots of traveling and take photos, but don't forget the words. Those ones matter too. Okay, I've got some work style things I'd like to show you, but I think you need some pictures. Can we have a few pictures, please, Jeffrey? Okay, there you are. So there's the title. One of the things that you have to do is to learn technology. And I did a maths course, so I didn't ever do typing or formatting or things like that. And so I have found the side of having to learn how to do PowerPoints, having to learn how to record your books, having to learn the latest in technology to keep up so you can talk to somebody in China is very important. So forgive any of the omissions. Shall we just move on? One flick, thank you. Not just a piece of cake being an author. I have a website, you can have a look at that. My daughter is my marketing manager. She's a marketing director in her own life, and I'm endlessly grateful to her. Right. The good bits she's done, the wonky bits I've done. Okay, this is the audio recording of Not Just a Piece of Cake being an author. Now, risky in the sense of the technology, but risky in the sense of what's the best format in which to portray your story. A lot of people like a print book. I quite like print books. I'm sure there's some librarians amongst this lot. I read books in the bath. I don't drop them in the bath, but I don't read electronic books in the bath. So print books, ebook's good that you can change the font, which makes it easier if you've got eye problems. Audio books really took off during lockdown Many people were listening as they exercised. And prior to that, I wanted to get this onto audio because I wanted to get it onto Audible. I had already recorded, I recorded hippo books for organisations like Visio in Australia and so on, but the picture books are quite short and I could manage that. But a longer work, such as my adult mystery, Celebrant Sleuth, I Do or Die, I recorded that. And I think there is value in having the author's nuances into the reading. But I found it utterly exhausting. I have the greatest of respect for actors who narrate books, full-length books. I haven't listened to Prince Harry. I don't know whether that counts or not, but it is a challenge. So the technology, I'm all in favour of stories being available in all formats, but if it's a technical book with lists, I don't think it works so well for audio, but it's fine for digital. My favourite book are the Braille copies, and I am so thrilled to have books that have gone into Braille and that are useful within families where one person is blind and the other is not, and they can both read the same book at the same time. The other format would be Auslan signing. I think that's immensely valuable also. Could we move on to the next one, please? Okay, this is the reality of being a writer. The myth on the left is you sit down and you have a creative moment and you write something. It doesn't work like that. The reality is a lot of procrastination. One writing course I was involved in, the Council of Adult Education in Melbourne offered a course on overcoming procrastination, and they had all these people enrolled, and on the day, absolutely zilch turned up. Nobody did it. They're all thinking about it. I say that to writers. You've got to start. All writers procrastinate, but they do it in different ways. They go and make a cup of coffee. They do, they fiddle around. They have very tidy desks or whatever it is. But you've actually got to get on and do it. I think you need a year to write a full book. It's not just the physical writing, it's the thinking it through and discarding things that don't work. So I think you need about a year. People say, oh, you're writing books for young children that might have 4 chapters in or something, but the concept, it is actually harder to write simply than it is to have very long sentences. So I think the picture on the right of the reality is probably a bit closer to it. One of the other factors is that writers don't just write. They are small businesses. They are often very small businesses because there's just them to do everything. Until recently, I was very lucky because my husband was my accountant, and now I have to do my own, and that's very challenging. But writers have to learn public speaking. They have to do the promotional side. They maybe travel interstate or overseas to festivals. Now, that sounds very glamorous, but it's actually quite challenging in terms of work style. And in between, you've still got to keep producing your books. Things like your books going into other languages. I'd have to say the one that gave me the greatest pleasure was the Tamil. I have a dear little book in Tamil, which is a work of art, but there are books I have translations in Korean and Chinese and so forth. But for a writer in Australia, if you don't have that, you wouldn't be able to make a living because you need to have an international market. So the reality of being a writer is that and living from that is you probably have another day job, or you have other skills within your family that can support you. It's quite challenging. And at the moment, I think it is even more so for many. Moving on. This is the most well-known book, Hippopotamus on the Roof Eating Cake. It is very rare for a book to reach 40 years. and still be in print all the time. I can't take the credit for that so much. It was the concept that worked very well, and the illustrations were very important too. But I was involved in the filmmaking and the theatre, Gary Ginnivan's production. I would say personally, one of the most magical moments was to sit in the audience of a theatrical production based on your book and watch not the stage so much as the audience watch the face reactions. And that was just, and I had a grandson alongside me watching, and it was, to me, that was the height, that your book had moved into another format and it still worked. So hippopotamusing is playing with words. It's imaginative problem solving, really. But there's a lot more formatting in producing a picture book than you would imagine. I spent one afternoon with the publisher positioning words quack, quack, quack for Sticky Beak, which is a well-known duck story, which came out at about the same time. And got a wonderful piece of fan mail that said, "Dear Sticky Beak," because a lot of the fan mail is written to the character. "Dear Sticky Beak, where were you before you were an egg? Before you were a duck, before you were an egg?" And I thought, oh, I'm so glad I didn't have to answer that in face to face. I had time to think of an answer. So I said, before I was a duck, I was an egg. And before I was an egg, I was an idea. And so that is the joy of some of the fan mail. It certainly stretches the imagination of the writer too. Okay, moving on. These are the three children. I think I've lost a couple on the left there somewhere, who were involved in the original creation of the hippo. The girl on the right is my daughter. She was about 8 then. Son was about 5. And this was a neighbour who was a couple of years older. And they came, it was a wet afternoon, and they came and said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "Well, why don't you write about Trevelyan's hippo on the roof?" So they drew the sketches and so on. And I thought they were quite good. I already had a publisher at that stage, and I approached her and she said, oh, she loved the concept, but they wouldn't be able to use the children's artwork. They'd have to use a known illustrator such as Deborah Nyland. The policy usually is to put a known with an unknown. I was the unknown and Deborah was the known. But the children's illustrations are in the Lou Rees collection in the University of Canberra, which has a lot of manuscripts and important things that relate to children's literature. I think somehow or other we lost a couple of the other two on the other side. I don't know what happened there. Thank you. We keep going. Yeah, okay. This is the outfit you have to get into in 4 minutes flat. All right. The pouch on the front of the gear, I had 3 cameras in there. Some of them freeze in those conditions. I should have had gloves on, but I think I'd taken the gloves off to touch something or other. The glasses are absolutely fantastic in the sunlit area of the ice there. The arrangement with the Antarctic division is they totally kit you out, but you must return everything you've used except anything that has touched your body. Well, that means the long johns, and I argued it meant the glasses, because I reckon those glasses that touch my eyebrows, that was part of my body, therefore I should be able to keep them. I lost that. But the outfit was, there are several layers under that, believe me, and it takes quite a bit to get the boots on too, but you need it. Everybody asked you how cold it was. You don't look at the temperature, you don't know what the temperature is, but you know that once you step outside from the out of the door on the ship, you've got about 2 minutes before it's really cold and you really feel it. That blue covering to the right of the screen there, that's the remains of the helicopter that crashed on top of us. And one of the things that I learned from that experience was how well those expeditioners had been trained for emergency. We all had done the emergency training, but they were absolutely fantastic going into action the moment there was a problem. And the real danger on a ship is fire. It's not the ice, it's fire. And we were on a ship that was carrying supplies, including petrol, etc., and fuel for the year. So it was a lot more dangerous than you realised. So it was a bit disconcerting seeing that and seeing the bits on the ice. The ice behind me is indicative of what you call being beset. That's stuck in the ice. You're actually stuck there. And every time they changed over, they'd try and move the ship bit forwards, bit backwards, give up. We were there for about 3 weeks. They used to put their birthdays up on a calendar, and somebody had a birthday in a year's hence, and he was worrying that he would be still there then, but we luckily weren't. The expedition does get stuck at times, and a ship such as that, which is primarily a supply ship, doesn't have the ice-breaking capacity of some of the others, such as the Aurora, who had to come to our rescue and who rubbed it in eventually. They played Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries when they rescued us later on, just to rub it in. Right, next, they're competitive. Okay, Antarctic Dad was one of the reasons that I was invited to take up the berth. It's now called an Antarctic Fellowship, but it was really just called a berth before. And it was for somebody who was not necessarily scientifically qualified. It was for a photographer. They've even had a poet there, a painter, a writer, whatever. And what they were particularly concerned about, and I think this was the reason I got the berth, was they were worried about the relationships with the families at home and of maintaining the contact. And I'd done some things for the Children's Hospital and for the Fire Brigade on issues such as this. So they really wanted a story that would link the predominantly men on the base with their families. Now, they use electronic connections, but they still wanted this. So that's where the Antarctic Dad came from. The DESO, people are known by their occupations. The DESO is the expedition mechanic. He thought he was the model for the boat, for the book. And he said, Hazel, looking pretty sharp there. That's me, isn't it? And I said, well, actually, it's not. Oh, well, you know, he was firmly convinced it was him, partly because he'd given me the idea. His family had given him a soft toy to take and photograph all over the Antarctic base and send back to the family. That little creature of his, I made it a kangaroo in this story, but it was a Canadian toy in the other story, in real life. And it was photographed in a few places that you couldn't put in a children's book. So I just adapted that idea somewhat. They also had a donation dog down there, a fiberglass one called Stay, that's stuck there all year. And that used to be photographed in some very unusual positions, but they were extremely charitable in donating lots of money to put into Stay. So this book was reissued recently, and Kippis is the name. The illustrator was Kevin Burgomaster. He was of Dutch origin, and Kippis was a significant term for him, and so his wife is a graphic designer. This is the second edition of this book because it's been so popular. It's been used by families where a parent is away for a long time in the military, on the oil rigs, in the mines, and in Antarctica. So it's been very, very popular. Next. Okay, just to give you some idea of the ways in which you can work, I've tended to use participant observation research. It's a fancy term for going and doing stuff, sticking your nose in, asking people lots of questions and finding out all sorts of stuff. My son, who was the one who originally came up with the hippo idea, in later life did a lot of adventuring. So he cycled solo from Ireland to Istanbul, and I forced him to write about that too. And also he walked the Appalachian Trail as a through walker, that is the entire trail, which takes 5 months. So that photograph on the front there, which became the cover, is not photoshopped. It does terrible things to a mother's heart to look at that, but I knew he'd got down afterwards, so he must have survived. That is the sort of shot that's very useful for a cover. And so I co-wrote in the sense that I did not walk the 5 months walk, nor cycle on a push bike from Ireland to Istanbul, but he did, and he wrote about it, and we worked together on that. But generally, I would actually go to the place. So most people are very, very helpful if you want to visit their workplace, whether it's a police car on a Saturday night or whether it's, unusual places. The only person who wouldn't let me go was the gentleman who was the expert on pyrotechnics and fireworks, because nobody had ever asked him about the rules and regulations before, which was his job. And he wouldn't let me go because he wanted to tell me absolutely everything. So you've got to be a good listener. And I was very grateful to him. Next. Complete your book in a year. The reason this book arose was I have a group at the Public Records Office in Melbourne. I was asked to take a year-long course there after I'd done a one-day workshop, because they said a lot of people are researching their families, but they sort of don't know how to put it together. And so I did that for a couple of years, and it was once a month, and we took a year to do it. And then along came the lockdown. And so the year had just started. So what I did was I wrote all the notes, and I wrote it as if it were a course that people could work through on their own, because at that stage we didn't know how long we'd be locked down for. Being in Melbourne, we were actually locked down longer than anybody else. But that was why that book came about. There was an electronic version of it too, and it's very, very practical. And as a result, all the people did finish. A couple have taken 2 years rather than one, but they did finish their stories, and I commend them. It is a lot harder to do it online because you don't have quite as much sharing with what you've written. But anyhow, that's where Complete Your Book in a Year came from. Shall we move on? Thank you. An authorpreneur is really, I suppose, what I'm talking about, that you act, and this is Sheila Hollingworth's illustrations, cartoons. You should always acknowledge your illustrators. This is a jokey way of looking at it, of the sorts of skills you need to stay in business as a writer and a workshop, being able to produce all of these things. So innovations, legal, you have to do crash courses in how to read contracts and copyright. Ideas, no problem with ideas, it's the shaping the ideas. Marketing, publicity. A lot of writers are very shy. They don't actually like writing, talking in public, but you sort of have to learn a bit because it's the only way to go. So you'll find quite a number, in my case, who have a teaching background, and that's been helpful. But there's a fine line between ego and publicising a book, and some people tip over into ego. And so it's very, you've got to keep your head together and be modest and quiet at times too. Moving on. Okay. One of the most important things is, who are you writing for? To a certain extent, you're writing for yourself, but if you are writing for an audience, you've got to consider what their needs are. What are the things that they want? If you're a professional writer, you've got to have some idea of how long it's going to take you to do that particular writing. It is, I'll let you into a secret, it is much, much harder to estimate how long a work of fiction will take you as opposed to non-fiction. The percentage of time on the actual writing and what I call e-administrivia, talking to some other writers to check it out, we agree about 75 to 80% of your time is on administrivia these days, particularly if you have a large backlist. So the actual physical writing is much, much smaller. You need a portfolio of skills and projects. I have a grandson who wants to be a writer. I said, listen, you've seen what your grandma does. You go and live a bit and get some other skills first. That's important. Things like rights, recycling them, looking at long-term income. Most people don't realise that writers are paid twice a year from royalties. That's all right? Things like PLR and ELR, that's public lending right and educational lending right, which are recompense for books that are read by multiple readers in libraries, are incredibly important and would probably be about a third of a writer's income. Post-lockdown, some very well-established writers have no income for the last 2 years, and that will tell you how bad things have been. Time and energy management. How are you going to fit things in? I've had a home office because when the children were young, it was the only way I could manage everything. Delegating or collaborating is another possibility. Using your story in a different format, a multimedia format, is helpful. Obviously, you want it, it doesn't always happen. A story that can travel. Now, when I went to New York, I didn't realise that the term sticky beak, which we Australians know as someone who sticks their nose in other people's business, is not a term they were familiar with. So a duck called sticky beak, particularly as a duck has a bill, not a beak, is not a good title because they would call it Nosy Parker, somebody who sticks their nose on. So there are some stories that travel well and there are some that don't. One of mine that's travelled further than I ever expected was due to the title. And the title, I think I'll show you, I think it's on here later, it was called Fake ID. And one of the publishers said to me, you realise, Hazel, it's not your book being terrific, it's just everybody's looking for fake IDs, so they dial up on your book. So sometimes you give them the wrong message. Why are you doing it? A book is a long commitment, or a play or a script. You've got to have some fun as well. So humour, writing humour is challenging, or enjoying the process. Okay, moving on. I think I'm going to get the wind up soon. Okay, research time management, personal experience. Well, that's where you draw on what your family has done. And I must admit, I have drawn on my family's expertise. When I wanted to poison a character in a mystery, I asked my son-in-law how I could best do it. He's an infectious diseases doctor, so that was very useful. Participant observation. The third category is the what if. And that's where I've ended up with a mind-reading cook who rides a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. At that stage, I hadn't ridden a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, but I knew it was the important one, so I found out about it afterwards. So what if is very satisfying, and adult satire and children's humour is actually very close in terms of writing skills. Next. Okay, consider the audiences you're writing for. I was asked to write for a series on Aussie heroes, and Weary Dunlop was one of them. And writing for maybe 9, 10-year-old readers, you still have to do as much research as you do for a full book. And to get the language so the children can read it, one of the editors changed my word camp to incarcerated. And I said, that's not appropriate for this readership. One of the difficulties in writing about Weary Dunlop was that he had actually been tortured in the camps, and it's very difficult to cover a subject like this. So what I did was I focused on how terrific he was with his hands at making things. He was always good at making and building things apart from the operating. So I wanted to have his figure with the hands for playing rugby, as well as the doctoring, as all the other things, but they wanted to put it on with his what do you call it, fruit salad, all his awards. Cycling solo island to Istanbul. That is meant to be an unusual angle of looking in the photo and photographing yourself, because if you're cycling solo, there's no one to take your photograph. The one down the bottom, I'll just mention very quickly. I write a story for each of my grandchildren each birthday. I have a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 12-year-old, nearly 13, and a 24-year-old. These are the little ones, and they had a gecko in their letterbox in Darwin, and so that's what that story is about. Completely different audiences. Moving, the backpackers, like the other one. General Store was the first book I ever wrote. We lived in a general store when I was a teenager, and you're always told to write about what you know. So I did. I did not expect to get that book accepted. I thought I'll have to write 3. I would not have called it General Store if I thought it was going to get picked up, because people think it's an army rank, General Store. It actually went into Finnish, which is unusual at that time. It's recently been picked up by the Untapped series of Australian literature, and they've done a new cover. But I think my designer on that was quite young, because that book was written at a time pre-decimal currency, and so he put the wrong currency on the lollies in the general store. We had to have them fixed up. The difference between the cents and pounds, shillings and pence. So that was interesting. So that book has survived. I'm not saying it's the greatest book in the world, but it was a rural story and it had no technology in it. So the technology was not dated in the story. So it's had a longer life. Next, I'm going to finish it. Outback Ferals, I put this one in just to let you know the challenges of covers. And originally, this is set in Darwin, in the outback. It is a sequel to the one set in Antarctica with a young scientist. A teacher approached me of graphic design and said, could you give our boys a chance to design a cover? And so these were the covers that the boys came up with, and the best one was to be used on the story. It's interesting to note who chooses which cover. The one on the far right was the one that was eventually chosen, because you could read the name on the spine. The one in the middle looked like a war zone, and the one on the left was not diplomatic because it looks like it's a crocodile taking a bite out of your head. So for those reasons, the one on the right. Outback Ferals is actually a good title, except some of the locals are worried it refers to them. It doesn't. It's had a very big uptake during lockdown. It was about the threat of a pandemic from feral pigs. And so suddenly something that was posed before the actual pandemic here has suddenly become topical. So it's been used a lot. Okay, next. And I will wind up, Jeffrey, in a minute when I get to the end of this. Yet some stories go from local to international. The books on Antarctica have an enormous international market because it's a subject like Everest that interests many people. Next. Your book can go into another language and it can arrive and you think, oh, that looks vaguely familiar. Oh, it's my book. Or you say, that doesn't look at all like the book I started with. Is that my book? The pink one is Korean. The one on the left is Polish. The front one is English. This is my next next most successful book in terms of translations. It's called Difficult Personalities. It's got a Russian edition too. And I wonder, a legal Russian edition, I wonder whether it indicates where difficult people are, but it does very well. I did it with a psychologist. Next. This is an interesting development of a celebrant sleuth who is asexual, which was a little ahead of the times. The second development of the story, Wed Then Den on the Gain, was actually set on the Gain. We were commissioned to do the script for the ABC. We finished the script, but there was no further funding. That was a very interesting experience to do that, and I learned a great deal. Next. This is recording it, which I found quite challenging, but in this studio of Harry's, it's very well done. He was an excellent producer. Moving on. This is one of the scenes from the Hippopotamus, Hippo the musical, which gave me the greatest joy of any of the projects. Gary Ginnivan was the major children's producer of quality kids' books for years, and to have your work taken into that dimension of music and song and performance, and to be able to watch the audiences. It travelled nationally. It was to go internationally, but unfortunately he passed away. Next. Grief and Loss in Schools has just come out recently, and there's a great deal of interest in that. Primarily plays that can be performed with characters who are not necessarily human. I've got butterflies and other things that mean it crosses the cultures and is quite widely used. Next. This is the Fake ID. And this one has gone into Tamil, and absolutely beautiful production. Can't read a word of it, but it looks fantastic. And it's really quite strange to have a book turn up. Think, oh, goodness. Had to make sure that the cover was accurate because the character plays hockey, not soccer. So that was all right. And that's the ebook. Moving on. Astrid the Mind Reading Chook is very simply written. So it means that students who have literacy issues can read it, and they really, really enjoy it. Technically difficult to write because you can have a chook that pecks on various high-tech appliances, but can't necessarily speak, but you can get the thoughts. The gifted students absolutely love this series. Okay, moving on. You know that you've made it when you become a question in the Northern Territory newspaper, because usually everything revolves around crocodiles. And so somebody sent me this, that who wrote the publish. So you absolutely know that that you've made it. I have other things to share, but I think you've had enough tonight. Two things I'd like to finish with. One is the importance of being able to read, and the fact that there are many in our society who can't and don't. I was in a country town, being asked to talk to a parents' night, and this mother came up to me on the side. She had a child in prep, and she said, do you have any other books I can, she would have been about 30, 35. Do you have any other books I can read, like There's a Hippopotamus on the Roof Eating Cake? Turned out she was the mother of a 5-year-old prep student in a remote school. As an author, I'd been talking with the other parents about encouraging your child to read. It's the only book I've ever read. The words have patterns I can work out. My daughter is in prep and is learning to read. I'm learning with her. Now, what a courageous woman. Admitting illiteracy, especially near other parents, this was a significant reminder to me that an idea can have the power to travel and influence, but the skills to share those words are also important. There was a fantastic librarian and diplomatic there, and she sorted, and I've since learned that the mother is functioning very well as a reader. In fact, she's slightly got in front of her daughter now. She's reading a bit ahead of the daughter, and I think that's wonderful. So once the book's published, it's got a life of its own. It might go places I've never been, but it's the idea of a book child out on its own. It's an embryonic idea that's walked. So I am so glad that I made the choice of being an author. I don't think it was not based on financial reasons, because authors struggle, but it's been a rich life in experiences. And I think my family have benefited. I mean, they haven't always agreed with that, but have benefited from that. And now they are writing their own stories, but I do not commit literary terrorism. I ask them if I'm going to use anything, but I've been given permission to use the gecko in Letterbox, and hopefully you'll see a story coming out on that later on. So I'd like to finish with a fun bio. You've been given the official bio of me, but this is the one. X is not an award-winning author, hates children and writes boring stories. Her hobbies are watching clouds, collecting pen tops, and making children go to sleep. Few readers finish a book, so don't waste money buying them. Right, I think it might be time I did have other things for you, but I'm also aware of the time at night. And I think you probably want your dinner. And the cake, not just a piece of cake, you perhaps need a proper dinner as well. My website, hazeledwards.com, has a lot of other resources there for adults as well as for children, and I hope they're helpful for you. And my daughter will be updating it soon.
Well, thank you, Hazel. But there's no cake because the hippopotamus has eaten it, I suspect.
Yes, that's right. Oh, yes. These days it's gluten-free. And the nutritional Nazis got stuck into me and said, you should have carrots, not cake. And so somebody said carrot cake. So there's always a solution.
We might have time for just one or two questions, but
I'm happy to answer questions, of course.
Hazel, can I ask, while people think about that, do your characters continue to live with you after you've finished the book, or do you put them aside and when you move on to something else?
I think perhaps the more abstract ones do. Like, I'm very fond of the one called Fame House, which is a large and clumsy cat born into a family pile of talented mice. I like that one because it epitomised, but the minor characters in stories, no. But if I write a series, yes, because that character's continuing to grow. I'm writing a political satire at the moment, and I've actually got rid of a few of the characters. I had too many, and they are living with me at the moment, yes. But when somebody says, oh, something about your last book or your latest book, it's not the latest book for me. I'm one ahead, and I'm thinking about that, not about the one. So the celebrant sleuth who solves mysteries at weddings and funerals and so on, for about 5 years I was developing that character, and I think that will still have a TV life. She comes with me sometimes if I see a situation, but primarily you're thinking about the one you work. Well, I don't work on only one, but the major one you're working on. Yeah, I do forget the names of minor characters at times. Yeah, of later books.
Thank you. Yeah. If there are others who've got questions, put up your hand and I'll pick someone. Yeah, Bruce Smalley or
Elaine.
Yeah.
Hazel, I have great difficulty buying books for my nieces and nephews. I don't have children of my own, so I'm not quite sure what age group a book is aimed at. How do I get over that? I usually end up finding a child in the store and asking if that book would be of interest to them.
Yeah, I think the important thing is interest level rather than age level.
Oh,
So if you've got a kid that's really interested in bugs or whatever it is, they'll manage a higher vocabulary anyway. I think the answer is to find yourself a bookshop if there is a functioning one near you. I tend to use Dimmick's in Campbell, which is the local one for Jeffrey and I, because they're very well informed about their books. The children's librarian in the local area will, but look, I have challenges too. My kids are all readers, but they go off in other areas I hadn't heard about either. So I think you ask them what sort of thing they like, then try the librarian, the teacher, or a kid that age. You know, what
doing.
I think you're on the right track, yeah. But then some will read well beyond their, like that little one I showed you, Arlo Arafura. He's been reading about bugs. Well, he's not reading, he's been looking at the pictures about bugs because he's 4, but he's interested in bugs. There's a lot of bugs in Darwin, as well as geckos.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Perhaps I could just add to that. As a writer, I don't like having an age group on my kids' books because I think it's limiting. So a really good picture story book, for example, should work for an adult as well, because they're the poor bunny who's going to have to read it 50 times, right? So it's got to work. So it should have a rhythm. Not a rhyme, but it should have a rhythm to the words. I always try them aloud. I try everything out before with an audience to see if it works. Yeah, I think you're on the right track.
Well, Hazel, it's been a fascinating time listening to you, and you've covered so much ground that
There's a bit I didn't cover,
amazing.
but never mind.
Well, I'm sure that obviously being an author is something that gives you great pleasure, and it's something that tonight has given us great pleasure and great appreciation. So on behalf of the OAA, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Good, thank you.